Alright, hey y'all. Today we're going to get into Seduction. So this came out in 79, I believe, and this is really, excuse me, this is what some people label as a turning point in Baudrillard's thinking, moreover in his style, his methodology, where some people suggest that it's in this text, or it's after this text, that Baudrillard really gets away from like the academic models of, performing academia, or the form that ideas should take in order to be, readily accepted by the general academic community. But this, for my own part, I find this hardly to belong to such a camp. So it's difficult to really suggest that there was such a clear shift at this point. And moreover, I generally resist the notion that there are like two Baudrillards, which is an idea that certainly floats around. There's the, more academically rigor Baudrillard, and then the more aphoristic, more deterritorialized Baudrillard, which to some extent I agree with. The ideas don't change all that much, though. And there is a fundamental consistency between his arguments from, even if you look at his first book, The System of Objects, and his last one, or some of his last ones, like The Intelligence of Evil, there are striking similarities, and there really is a progression in his thought. But anyways, to get into Seduction, I want to take a moment to read a couple of things out of two other books first. The reason I want to do this is because, and this is just me watching other videos and other kinds of explanations of this text, just to see what people are saying about it. And what I want to try and combat is the idea that Baudrillard sees a fundamental connection between the masculine and the feminine with men and women, where these two things do not go hand in hand. There is not an easy transposition between the masculine and real men and women and the feminine. That's an idea that people often have bastardized, and I think it happens because it makes things simple in a way, and it gives a face to these kind of broad metaphorical categories, i.e. men and the masculine and the feminine. So the first passage I'd like to read that really disturbs that easy transposition between the two is actually from The Consumer Society, so Baudrillard's second book, where he says that the relation of the masculine and the feminine to real men and women is relatively arbitrary. Pretty simple to digest that, I guess. It's pretty self-explanatory. And then the second is actually in Radical Alterity, which is for the most part, a book-length interview with Marc Guillaume, where Marc Guillaume is trying to unravel the idea of seduction, which I'll explain in more detail, or at least I'll provide some kind of an explanation here. But what Marc Guillaume says is that you decide that a woman is your destiny, and you take on that destiny in total indifference to her physical or psychological being. Pure seduction means saying, "You will be her, and I will follow you." Men have access to this experience, but not women. To which Baudrillard replies, "I don't know. You are bringing in sexual difference, which I had not put in play." So the reason I'm doing this is because it would be too limiting, in a sense. It would really place boundaries around the discussion of seduction that I'll undertake here if we simply locate either the masculine or the feminine within male or female traits, or as being some kind of correlative between the two, whereas that is not at all what is going on here, in my mind. So he begins his book by saying that nothing is less certain today than sex. Behind the liberation of its discourse, and nothing today is less certain than desire, behind the proliferation of its images. So this lays the foundation for what Baudrillard wants to do here, and he does that primarily by making, or he does whatever that is, by making a clear split, or illustrating there to be a split between seduction and desire, or, to put it in other terms, sex and seduction, if you will, where these two things do not go hand in hand. Baudrillard, what he's trying to do here is he's trying to resist the idea that the emancipation of sex, or the emancipation of sexuality, is in itself some kind of move towards a liberatory type discourse, or a liberatory type societal configuration. So sexuality then corresponds to, for Baudrillard, in taking from Freud, sexuality belongs to a masculine principle, where, he says, paraphrasing Freud, there is one sexuality, one libido, and it is masculine. Sexuality has a strong discriminative structure centered on the phallus, castration, the name of the father, and repression. So a good supplement to this book, in a sense, is Anti-Oedipus, that takes on the Oedipal dimension much more rigorously. But here, Baudrillard wants to think about sexuality, or sex as it takes the physical form, as being indicative of the masculine. So again, I want to reiterate that he uses the masculine as a metaphor. The feminine, on the other hand, plays with the role of images. How sex and sexuality are taken up to the image power, where they are, in a sense, they're placed on a terrain, or placed on a plateau, in which they are allowed to change, adapt, and flow, if you will. Whereas in the masculine, there's always some kind of reduction to a universal, homogeneous biological function, which limits, which sets boundaries on the possibility of sexuality, the forms it can take, what it can mean, and then, of course, we inevitably end up in this domain of a certain kind of repression, hence the use of Freud here. But very much following Foucault, or not so much following, but in the first volume of the History of Sexuality, Foucault says that in challenging the repressive hypothesis, it's not so much that there was this kind of all-prevailing discourse or counter-discourse to sexuality that hoped to see it become obfuscated, kind of sequestered under, a puritanical religious principle, but instead we actually saw this kind of explosion of sexuality, or discourse surrounding sexuality, which Foucault wanted to interrogate and ask, okay, to what extent does this explosion of sexuality not necessarily mark an emancipation, but actually open the door for different centers of power, the way they take the form of psychiatry, of, the clinic or whatever, that open up new forms of control over these new discourses around sexuality. Baudrillard is doing very much the same thing here. So he says, this is very much what is happening today. Erotic polyvalence, the infinite potentiality of desire, different connections, diffractions, libidinal intensities, all multiple variants of a liberatory alternative, coming from the frontiers of a psychoanalysis free of Freud, or from the frontiers of desire free of psychoanalysis. Now, all of these elements, desire, the libido, diffractions, libidinal intensities, these all correspond to the domain of the masculine, in that they presuppose there to be, first of all, a certain subject position that is able to potentiate, that is able to detect and then mobilize a sort of sexual energy that will, lead to whatever, whether it be instant gratification, some kind of utopic societal setup a la Marcuse, or anything like that. For Baudrillard, that is not quite the case. And as I stated, in very much the same way as, in the same vein as Foucault, Baudrillard's weary about this liberatory discourse, or this notion of liberation coming out of sexuality's emancipation. So in this way, Baudrillard, rather problematically, or quite problematically, at least in the discussions I've had with some feminist scholars, he states that the women's liberation in like the 60s, precisely because it, very much in relation to Irigary's thought, sort of opened up the domain for an essentialism around women to be brought into fruition. Now what he says is that the danger of the sexual revolution for the female is that she will be enclosed within a structure that condemns her to either discrimination, and the structure is strong, or a derisory triumph within a weakened structure. So all that this would allow, opening up the discourse around sexuality for women, would actually be in the indoctrination into an oppressive system. Now, is it Baudrillard's place to say what women should or should not want? I don't know. But his suggestion here is valid to an extent, and I think it shares some affinities with certain discourses around neoliberal type feminist movements that suggest quite simply that if we add women and stir to various CEO type positions, then sexism will disappear or other forms of oppression will disappear, which surely is not the case, where those zones of power actually are indicative of the issue, and adding more people to it does not actually help that issue. So very much the same argument is being leveled here, except not administrative type positions, but sexuality in itself. The masculine corresponds to the very split between men and women. The masculine corresponds to there being a reality principle, to a pleasure principle, to a biological certainty, to a libido, to psychoanalysis, to the psyche. All of these correspond to a masculine principle that is part of a cultural logic of dissecting, of excavating, of performing, historical analyses that see at the very root of things an origin, that see a history, that see a fundamental truth. Whereas the feminine, rather, corresponds to the destructuration, the deconstruction, if I use that term rather loosely, of the binaries established by the masculine principle. So the deconstruction of, and again, I'm using that term really loosely, so please forgive me, of the masculine and the feminine, of the truth and falsity, anything of that sort. So the feminine for Baudrillard, then, he states, belongs to the realm of seduction, where seduction is what destabilizes any given system in favor of something else. So up until this point, up until Seduction, the book, the term Baudrillard would use was reversibility. Now this is an important detail, because reading his earlier stuff, there are components of a seductive principle, but he doesn't really use the term. It comes up here and there, but the term he uses is reversibility. So what it implies is that no given structure is in of itself a perfect, never-ending structure. It has embedded within it the very possibility of its undoing, i.e. in the form of reversibility. So in order to resist anything, and this is the gripe, one of the gripes that Baudrillard leveled against Marx, was that Marx didn't recognize the extent to which any given system can and will anticipate its antithesis by subsuming the very logic of that antithesis into its own ethos, if you will. So there isn't that necessarily that possibility of synthesis, but rather the maintenance of two very opposing ideas that actually perform to keep one another afloat, however difficult that might be to grasp. Where Baudrillard wants to almost see things crumble by their own force, precisely because they rely on a form of power. So again, if I reiterate one of his theses in Forget Foucault, is that there was once a time when, kings or tyrants would crumble precisely because they claimed to house a certain power. But now in the almost equal proliferation of discourse and counter-discourses, we see the maintenance of these forms of power almost in the oppressive democratization of opinion, which is a difficult, it's an idea I struggle with, but I think it's what he's getting at here. So, sort of a digression, but that was the order in which, or that was the lexicon he was working with, kind of reversibility, destructuration, anything of that sort. That all gives way to seduction. And reversibility does come back in some capacity in his later work. And it's these two terms are two terms that he uses interchangeably at some points. Seduction's correspondence to the play of images, the play of signification, then places it in a certain realm. And by extension, the masculine, or power, corresponds to another realm. So what Baudrillard says is that seduction represents mastery over the symbolic universe, while power represents only mastery of the real universe. So in a sense, seduction then corresponds to signification, which implies a correlative to the symbolic, rather reluctantly, but I'll do it anyways. And then power, or the masculine, corresponds to a certain mastery of the real universe. So real universe, implying there to be very universal material conditions to existence, that kind of the early Marxist humanism type stuff, like there's a world out there and it has these certain principles and we can take from it what we will, and that's it, and that's all. Whereas Baudrillard, thinking back to symbolic exchange and death, wants to think about, in that case, exchange as not necessarily corresponding to some kind of economic principle, but how exchange can take on, using a rather broad term, a symbolic principle, where there doesn't seem to be some kind of law of equivalences or a certain logic to it, but how things can be exchanged without there being some kind of fundamental reason behind it, or one reason kind of indicative of post-modernity type thinking, or contemporary thinking about what should constitute proper exchange, equivalence, anything of that sort. So the role of seduction then for Baudrillard is to, he states, the capacity immanent to seduction, to deny things their truth and to turn it into a game, the pure play of appearances, and thereby foil all systems of power and meaning with a mere turn of the hand. So this lays the groundwork for one of his central theses, and one of the most important ideas that he levels in, it's eluding me. I want to say it's in Fatal Strategies, where he has some kind of derivative of this idea, but what he states is that if the world truly is enigmatic, if the world truly is obscure, then our project of theory should not be to try and make the world more truthful, to try to better understand the world, to give it more meaning, but to actually make it more enigmatic, to try and make the world more obscure. That is what seduction does. It wrests things away from their truth principle and turns it into a game. And this is an idea he takes up at the end of this book, which I'll expound on more then. But he opposes the rule, indicative of games, or rules in games, and the law, indicative of society, or of the realm of truth. And I apologize for using these terms so broadly, but it's kind of what we have here. Femininity, or the feminine's relationship to simulation, then, is a very ambiguous one, because simulation is that system that corresponds to the endless proliferation of signs, where signs don't have any connection to a real referent, but is not necessarily an oppressive phenomenon, but is something that actually has a history, which is what I presented in Symbolic Exchange and Death, where Baudrillard lays out the history of simulation coming from the Renaissance to up to today. And in what way then, or what kind of relationship, if we can postulate that characteristic of simulation, what relationship does it have to the feminine? For Baudrillard, there is a mutual understanding between the two, and they work together in some sense. But there's a very odd moment when he says that the strange coincidence points to the ambiguity of the feminine. It simultaneously provides radical evidence of simulation, and the only possibility of its overcoming. In Seduction, precisely. So this is probably the most, in my mind, the most complicated idea that unravel in Baudrillard. And it goes as follows, or question. Is simulation an oppressive force? Is simulation something to be overcome? To which he never provides a real answer. And this is something that comes up again in The Perfect Crime, where he says quite simply that simulation and reality are not opposites, where simulation and reality actually work hand in hand, which is an impossibly difficult idea to grasp, because there is a tendency in all the secondary, number of the secondary sources I've read, there is a tendency to romanticize an idea of a non-simulated space or epoch or a pre-simulated era, which I believe for Baudrillard would be totally absurd. Simulation has always been present. Ever since, one of the earliest examples would be, and this is an example he gives in Fatal Strategies, would be Helen of Troy. God, I believe it was Fatal Strategies. He states that Helen of Troy was one of the first instances of simulation that we have, in record, which is difficult because, at least of all the kind of secondary literature I've read, and the relationship that people have imbued on Baudrillard with the Matrix film, there is a tendency to split or to create a distinction between simulation and reality. So when he talks about simulation here as being that thing that exists with the feminine or the play of signification, it is at one time, a constitutive element of the condition for our survival, or of our opposing power, of our opposing oppression in the form of seduction. But at the same time, seduction is what undermines simulation. So what I will propose here is that there are two forms of simulation. In one of his earlier books, he states that there is actually two forms of reality as well. There was conflictual reality, or contradictory reality, and non-contradictory reality. So it's kind of annoying that he didn't think of two different terms, but rather just kind of provides that one moment to define reality as such, as having two possible paths. But then later on, he just uses the term reality, where the reader has to kind of fill in the blank, like which reality is he talking about here? And if we accept his suggestion, the one I just kind of paraphrased from The Perfect Crime, that simulation and reality go hand in hand, then I believe we can, by extension, apply that same logic to simulation, where there is contradictory simulation and non-contradictory simulation. So the one that he would be opposing here is non-contradictory simulation. So some of the characteristics of that, or some of the elements that provide the condition for that form of simulation's possibility, is in, the realization of certain, truths that are unchanging, solidified in images, like the case of pornography, for instance, something I brought up here before in Foucault, how the proliferation of the image of sexuality in the case of pornography do not actually serve to obscure sex, but actually ground it in the hyperreal form. that would actually be, hyperreal would probably correspond to that, or be the term used to designate the non-contradictory simulation. Whereas what opposes that, and I think this is where seduction shares an affinity, is with the contradictory simulation, where things are given the chance to change, where things are given the chance to not make sense, to not correspond to a broader cultural logic of knowing, of a certain a priori reasoning, but are actually open to complete obscurity. In this way, femininity for him is a principle of uncertainty. So it causes the sexual poles to waver. It is not the pole opposed to masculinity, but what abolishes the differential opposition, and thus sexuality itself, as incarnated historically in the masculine phallocracy, as it might be incarnated in the future in a female phallocracy, if, the project of women's liberation sees a logical conclusion. So he gives the example then of transvestism, which is, a very outdated term, but here we have it, where he states that neither homosexuals nor transsexuals, transvestites like to play with the indistinctness of the sexes. The spell they cast over themselves as well as others is born of sexual vacillation and not, as is customary, the attraction of one sex for the other. So he uses this example to kind of illustrate the absurdity of the male-female split, right? How the two can very easily be overthrown, precisely because for Baudrillard, if we accept his thesis that simulation has a historical component to it, the only one of the primary conditions for the realization, or conditions of the possibility of there to be two different sexes, is by their occupying certain roles within the realm of signification, which is always up to change, which is always up to negotiation. And the transvestite uses that, or in a sense plays with that distinction, which for Baudrillard is like, well, look at that. It's not as though there's some kind of fundamental biological connection between women wearing skirts or men wearing pants. Like that's an absurd distinction to make. So I'll take this moment then to kind of level my own grievances against the contemporary discourse surrounding, scientific, the scientific evidence pointing to the very fundamental distinctions between men and women, as though there's some kind of evolutionary impulse that makes, women dress a certain way because clothes are natural, I guess, or the existence of kitchens are natural. But that whole discourse, or the discourse surrounding that, at least in using Baudrillardian terminology, would correspond to that non-contradictory realm of simulation, where it would be wrong to simply input onto the technological era, or the realm of the virtual epoch, the designation of simulation, where simulation is, precisely because of its historical character, exists across time and space, and can then correspond to other institutions, as the one I just gave, like, the very unambivalent discourse surrounding scientific validity that is floating, it's burning through us like a wildfire right now. The position of women in a position of subserviency to men then is something that Baudrillard wants to challenge a bit, because he wants to remain faithful to his own lexical field here, and suggest that reversibility is something that cuts across everything. So to that he says, beginning with the exchange in primitive societies, stupidly interpreted as the first stage of women as object, all that we have been asked to believe, the universal discourse on the inequality of the sexes, the theme song of an egalitarian and revolutionary modernity, reinforced these days with all the energies of a failed revolution, is perhaps one gigantic misunderstanding. The opposite hypothesis is just as plausible, and, from a certain perspective, more interesting. That is, that the feminine has never been dominated, but has always been dominant. So the reason he puts this idea forward is because he sees a value being located in the realm of signification, where if we attach meaning to a biological imperative or a sort of libidinal type truth, we are opening ourselves up to the possibility of, being undone. We are essentially laboring under the illusion of a certain trompe-l'oeil, of a game, of a idiotic play of kind of Descartes' demon thing. We are existing under, under an illusion, but the bad kind of illusion, because he brings up illusion in his later work that is a very good thing, but here I'm going to use the term as being a bad thing. Whereas the feminine, because it corresponds to the realm of signification, has a better relationship to things as they are, that is, as they present themselves in the form of images. So it is in that way precisely because it allows for the possibility of change, the possibility of a kind of rhizomatic being that is much more fruitful and much more liberating, if I'll use that term, than kind of occupying oneself with very basic truths that govern our existence and keep us within that some kind of territorial domain. Baudrillard goes so far as to say that the feminine is not just seduction, it also suggests a challenge to the male to be the sex, to monopolize sex and sexual pleasure, a challenge to go to the limits of its hegemony and exercise it unto death. And I love that idea. And we see it coming out in, if we were to isolate a certain culture and give them this idea of a fundamental truth, or fundamentals of truth that they would have to abide by, you would inevitably see a very, very quick destabilization of said truths in favor of either, total destruction or of the attainment of some kind of new singularity that would be precisely by its disavowing that initial truth would be predicated on a sort of lie, or would be so absurd that it would, what a fantastic potential. I wonder what that would look like. But it's interesting here. Baudrillard performs this kind of reversibility, this classic Baudrillardian reversal here, suggesting that it is not as though men, so the masculine corresponds to this realm of truth or power because that is what they've arrived at, or the masculine has arrived at by some teleological principle, but they've actually been seduced into that position or kind of tricked into it by the feminine, by the unknown, as just another game to be played. I wish I had a better analogy. I wonder, there's a really great film that depicts this. It's one of the best kind of demonstrations of, or what I will call kind of a demonstration of seduction. And it's a South Korean film called The Wailing. It's a horror film. And without giving too much away, there's a moment, the film is shrouded in ambiguity, where you don't necessarily know what is happening. You don't necessarily know who the bad person is or who the antagonist is. And there's a point at the end when, after all this energy is expended on revealing a certain person to be the bad person, they then change form, they then become, the embodiment of everything evil, in a sense. But it's still unclear whether or not they are the bad person. And I believe that to be a moment of seduction, because that person is not, it's not as though they fundamentally embody certain characteristics that place them in that position as being bad or whatever. But it is, they're being called into that position that places them there. It's them being, I guess, in a sense, seduced into that position. And by extension, they seduce the inspector's gaze to them. And there's this, it's just a very playful, yet terrifying subversion of the very clear distinction between, good and bad, very clear distinction between, evil and good. And it's really it's a great movie though. Really go watch it. But it's interesting to think about it in that way. I read seduction as, or what opposes seduction, power, pornography, the realization of these sort of drives. What they do, or they operate as a strategy, in my mind, a strategy against the principle of seduction through a certain compensation. So if there is some basic affinity between seduction and power, and that seduction is kind of the condition for the possibility of anything, or if seduction does have some affinity with sexuality, in that it is the play of appearances, it is the making one vulnerable, it's the opening one up to the possibility of change, then what we have done in the case of like pornography, in the case of these power, in our discussion around power, is we've pushed it to their limit, precisely because we think that by adding more, we will then attain, in a sense, that initial condition of seduction, or we will then attain a sort of otherness to the situation we've crafted for ourselves, which is in some ways the case. And Baudrillard is reluctant, or he's hesitant to say that we're just entering some kind of purely oppressive epoch, where in the take for instance in the Vital Illusion, when he meditates a bit on Heidegger, and he says that at one time technology corresponded to this, at least in Heidegger, this kind of a negative ontology. But he states that, in quoting Heidegger, that we actually open ourselves up to a new mystery, to which Baudrillard says that maybe this, this realization of all things is just another stage in the progression of being, or of kind of like just another epistemological category that is open to a new set of rules, a new set of principles, a new form of seduction that is part of, I guess, what has always been, and is not radically different from what has historically been the conditions for seduction or simulation, or the good kind of simulation, but actually are very much a part of it. However, seduction is still what resists the endless accumulation or the endless proliferation of things. So seduction in that way opposes production. It opposes sex. It opposes power. If, I maintain the clear distinction between such things. Because if we apply, the seductive principle to the seduction's antitheses, then we see the deconstruction or the destabilization of any such dichotomous, bifurcations, right? Or clear bifurcations, and therefore disrupt the seductive principle in itself, which is, this discourse is infectious. It's difficult to navigate, but it's interesting, because if seduction, coming out of a discourse around reversibility, is true to itself, then we also see its own demise embedded within its own being, right? It's ontologically predisposed to be undermined. And he says quite funnily that ours is a culture of premature ejaculation. That obsession, that he's speaking to that obsession with, instant gratification, with our connection to the body, with our connection to truth, that we have to maintain repeatedly through the institutions we've crafted, where, seduction is supposedly opposed to this. And he even goes so far as to say that increasingly all seduction, all manner of enticement, which is always a highly ritualized process, or a symbolic one, is effaced behind a naturalized sexual imperative, behind the immediate and imperative realization of desire, which is very interesting, because he sees very possibility of seduction disappearing, an idea that he is not consistent about at all. Seduction can, in Baudrillard's entire oeuvre, in his entire body of work, seduction can be simultaneously effaced, yet can also never be destroyed. It's something that's always already there. It's something that cannot be removed from, I guess, social organization in any way. It arrives on the scene as soon as, there is a thing called consciousness. There is a thing called being. And it's not it's not reserved, like in the humanist streams, to humans at all. It is something that exists in nature, it exists in the universe, it exists with the sun's distribution of light to the earth. These are things that all correspond to the law of seduction, supposedly, in that there's always a play between two things. There's always at least two things. I don't want to limit it by saying two, but there's always a giving and a taking that don't correspond to, our logic of giving and taking, or the law of equivalence, or the economic notions of exchange. So this suppression of seduction has led us to a point where the sexual has triumphed over seduction and annexed it as a subaltern form, or that thing that is kind of romanticized and fetishized, what we are trying to reattain without necessarily knowing it. So then he states that nudity will never abolish seduction, which seems like a contradiction to what he had just stated. And he continues, for it immediately becomes something else, the hysterical enticements of a different game, one that goes beyond it. So even here he's entertaining the idea that seduction is always already there, right? Even in the most realized zone, the orgy, in term he uses in The Transparency of Evil, or the realization of all desires, there's seduction still finds a place. What form it necessarily takes is difficult to grasp, precisely because seduction resists the idea of taking a single form. But it's always already there, and it's an idea, I sound like a broken record, I know, but I'm trying to get that notion across, because I really resist the readings of Baudrillard that, like in the case of simulation, suggest that there's very clear dichotomies to be established, which can then allow us to romanticize certain positions in time and space, where we weren't operating under the aegis of a certain oppressive principle of simulation or of power or whatever. And Baudrillard is clear when bringing up the actual plight of women throughout history that this was a very real thing. And for him, it simply corresponds to another strategy of power, of the masculine principle of wanting to know, that has historically inputted onto women this this image of sexuality, this image of desire, of seduction, that they have tried to oppress precisely because it's scary. A good example of this is, we think of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, where, you have Victor Frankenstein constructing a monster to bypass women, right? Men can procreate too. We can skip the icky, yucky, unknowable type mysterious woman, and we can replace her with this new scientific form, which of course backfires. And in that way, Frankenstein is a really good example of how science sees its own end, right? How science actually always comes back, or that kind of displacement of a sort of universal high truth onto a certain domain in the form of science or whatever, turns that back on itself. And the term he uses later on is its cannibalistic function. How these extreme forms of power always turn back on those that employ them. Baudrillard then turns his attention to Foucault once again, where he says in this rather long passage that this is why one must completely turn around what Foucault has to say in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, while still accepting its central hypothesis. Foucault sees only the production of sex as discourse. He is fascinated by the irreversible deployment and interstitial saturation of a field of speech, which is at the same time the institution of a field of power, culminating in a field of knowledge that reflects, or inverts, or invents it. But from whence does power derive its somnambulistic functionality, this irresistible vocation to saturate space, if neither sociality nor sexuality exist unless reclaimed and staged by power? Perhaps power, too, does not exist unless reclaimed and staged by knowledge, in brackets theory, in which case the entire ensemble should be placed in simulation, and this too perfect mirror inverted, even if the truth effects it produces are marvelously decipherable. I didn't know that word was so hard to say. So he goes on. Furthermore, the equation of power with knowledge, this convergence of mechanism over a field of rule they have seemingly swept clean, this conjunction described by Foucault as complete and operational, is perhaps only the concurrence of two dead stars whose last glimmerings still illuminate each other, though they have lost their own radiance. In their original authentic phase, knowledge and power were opposed to each other, sometimes violently, as were, moreover, sex and power. But if today they are merging, is this not due to the progressive extenuation of their reality principle, of their distinctive characteristics, their specific energies? Their conjunction, then, would herald not a reinforced positivity, but a twin indifferentiation, at the end of which only their phantoms would remain, mingling amongst themselves, left to haunt us. So this is an extension of the thesis, or the idea that Baudrillard proposes in Forget Foucault. One of the central theses is that, power has never really existed, and that Foucault, by giving it a face, in a sense, even if that face is multifaceted, reinvigorates the sense of there being this thing called power, where there is not a recognition in Foucault of, the simulating apparatuses that operate behind the construction of power. Moreover, a conversation about seduction, or how, thinking back to how I kind of illustrated it earlier, how men corresponding, or the masculine corresponding to the domain of power, don't achieve that point just by some teleological principle, but are seduced into it by the ambiguity, by the unknown of the feminine. In very much the same way, power only comes into fruition that way, and it doesn't correspond to a history per se. And the only position that they really have is in the form of a specter, a thing that is simultaneously there while not being there. In either case, they are surely destabilized of their privileged position in whatever kind of scheme we place them in. And another way that Baudrillard sees, in the case of Foucault, something lacking is a discourse around simulation, but specifically when talking about sex, there's a startling absence of a discussion of pornography and what role that necessarily plays. Where Baudrillard says, and he gives, he talks about pornography rather extensively, that it corresponds to a disenchanted simulation, a truer than true, the height of the simulacrum, whereas enchanted simulation, the trompe-l'oeil, falser than false, operates at the level of the secret of appearances. So again, this is all opposed to the kind of Freudian psychoanalytic domain that suggests that, beneath the surface, there is this thing from which all drives emanate, from which all want derives. Where Baudrillard wants to think of us as just being, we only exist on the surface, really. We are in very much that capacity, a kind of body without organs. Now, there's an important distinction to draw now between Deleuze and Baudrillard. I've been resisting saying his name in French just because it sounds very, very douchey. But there is a little bit of a lack of work done by Baudrillard in generating a distinction between he and Deleuze. And like I had said in Forget Foucault, the second half, the interview with Sylvain Lartrenger, takes that question on a little bit. But whereas Deleuze in A Thousand Plateaus with Guattari really call for, deterritorializing oneself, like craft new space for yourself, make something for yourself that is outside of the, territorial domain of like the construction of the face that grounds you or something like that, in favor of this kind of rhizomatic intensity or these possibilities. Baudrillard is much more resistant to the possibility of mobilizing any such things, where for him that would correspond to the domain of desire, where there would be a kind of, truth to either subjectivity, a truth to, moreover to then, by allocating that subjectivity to dissecting, to uncovering the hidden truths of your own body or what you want, and then mobilizing them, all this would correspond to that domain of disenchanted simulation, or the truer than true, the height of the simulacrum, pornography, if you will. Where for Baudrillard, and this is one of the really complex ideas in him, it's that it just seems like he wants any sort of change to come about miraculously, to just sort of happen, like fairy dust. A difficult pill to swallow, I know, but it certainly is an interesting one, because that is the fundamental property of seduction, where it's not something that can be mobilized. Seduction is not provocation, a distinction that bell hooks takes up pretty well, but seduction is what forces people or things or anything out of their being, out of their wants, out of their desires, into total newness, without that being, without that thing having any say in the matter. And this, that distinction between Deleuze and Baudrillard is again hard to map, because, as he says, seduction cannot possibly be represented, because in seduction the distance between the real and its double, and the distortion between the same and the other, is abolished. Bending over a pool of water, Narcissus quenches his thirst. His image is no longer other. It is a surface that absorbs and seduces him, which he can approach but never pass beyond, for there is no beyond, just as there is no reflexive distance between him and his image. The mirror of water is not a surface of reflection, but of absorption, where you don't see yourself because there is no self to see. Yourself is only the possibility of your not being a self in the seductive moment, where you are only measured by your I use it, the whole champ lexical, the whole lexicon around seduction is so difficult to navigate, because it's all coming out of discourse around production, around power. So when I say like measuring up, it belongs to that category, or to that thing that opposes seduction, which is difficult. It's difficult to, get us out of that. But the condition for one's possibility is predicated not on that thing attaining a certain, fundamental ontology, but precisely in that they're being susceptible to something else, to other spaces, to anything like that. So in the case of Narcissus, right, they aren't looking at themselves, they're looking at what they can become, which is never themselves, which is just a constant, it's like a constant tug of war, right, trying to negotiate a self within this constant, the infinite gravitational pull of that, what seduces you. So in the seductive moment then, Baudrillard sort of concludes that idea that to seduce is to die as reality and reconstitute oneself as illusion. Becoming an illusion, though, and this is in one of the most recent collections of interviews, someone asks him what does illusion mean for him, and for him illusion is a form of death, because illusion means the total destabilization of what one is in favor of infinite possibility, and infinite possibility that's always occurring, while simultaneously attaining some kind of singularity that is not susceptible to change. It's all very confusing. But him saying this here, to die as a reality and be born again as illusion, is I enjoy that idea quite a bit, because it's not really a praxis, but it does give a semblance to some kind of, I guess, concreteness, or it kind of solidifies or crystallizes the idea of seduction. Like, what is the end goal? What form does it necessarily take? And even my wanting such an explanation is just in the service of a sort of masculine principle of wanting to know, of excavating, of being very anxious about the possibility of not knowing. So one of the things that oppose, science, power, or whatever, for Baudrillard that he meditates on is astrology, where he states that the deception can be inscribed in the sky. Its power will not be diminished. Every sign of the zodiac has its form of seduction, for we all seek the favor of a meaningless fate, and place our hopes in the spell that might result from some absolutely irrational conjuncture. Here lies the strength of the horoscope and zodiacal signs. No one should laugh at astrology, for he who no longer seeks to seduce the stars is the sadder for it. In effect, many a person's misfortune comes from their not having a place in the sky, within a field of signs that would agree with them, that is to say, in the last instance, from their not having been seduced by their birth and its constellation. Because because astrology corresponds so heavily to the realm of signification, right? There is no attachment to science, right? People who are, high prophets of like the scientific discourse scoff at astrology as being this thing that has no sense, doesn't correspond to a general logic of scientific observation and deduction, so therefore it has no meaning. When, we know full well that our, even science predicated heavily on the construction of stories, on the construction of certain elements that allow for the condition of its possibility. And it would be naive to undermine the role that, the meaning people have had with the stars, with the gods, all throughout the course of history means nothing. But for Baudrillard, he very much aligns that with seduction as being that which opposes, or one of those things that oppose, the high humanistic standard associated with a material imperative that it grounds everything in the earth or the body or whatever, and turns to the cosmos in a sense, that turns to something exterior to us that is always, precisely because, simultaneously because of its geographical distance from us, but also because of its impossibility of really conceptualizing the magnitude of stars. We are always challenged by them. We are always challenged to attain that degree of what I would call being, or that level of non-masculineness, or the non-being part of a mappable, quantifiable world of the unknown, or what is at least unknown to us. And of course, NASA and Elon Musk are fucking that up because we're suddenly giving it a face, right? Space exploration is not doing great things for Baudrillard's theory here. To kind of round off this episode, I'll end this one with Baudrillard's thinking about a story called The Death in Samarkand. Well, anyways. So the story goes as follows. It's a story of a soldier who meets death at a crossing in the marketplace and believes he saw him make a menacing gesture in his direction. The man then rushes to the king's palace and asks for the king for his best horse in order that he might flee during the night far from death, as far as Samarkand. Upon which the king summons Death to the palace and reproaches him for having frightened one of his best servants. But Death, astonished, replies, "I didn't mean to frighten him. It was just that I was surprised to see the soldier here, when we had a rendezvous tomorrow in Samarkand." So what Baudrillard does with this story is he suggests that this is a brilliant story that captures seduction, because it implies that there's no escaping the law of seduction, where it is not as though the soldier is actually able to dodge death, but the soldier is, without, totally unbeknownst to them, are seduced into it by their misrecognizing the appearance of death in some capacity. So he states that yes, one runs towards one's fate, all the more surely by seeking to escape it. Yes, everyone seeks his own death, and the failed acts are the most successful. Yes, signs follow an unconscious course, but all this concerns the truth of the rendezvous in Samarkand. It does not account for the seduction of the story, which is in no way an apologue of truth. So that the gesture that the man believes death gave him doesn't actually correspond to, wanting of death to kill the man, but is just a sign amongst others that led the man to go, to go to the place where he will die, where following the destiny of the world or whatever, he will die. So had death been, but Baudrillard's word, had death been content to call the soldier back into order, the story would lose its charm. The gesture does not, everything here is hinged on a single involuntary sign. The gesture does not appear to be part of a strategy, nor even an unconscious ruse, yet it takes on the unexpected depth of seduction. That is, it appears as something that moves laterally, as a sign that, unbeknownst to the protagonist, including death, as well as the soldier, advances a deadly command, an aleatory sign behind which another conjunction, marvelous or disastrous, is being enacted. So it's unbeknownst to death, of course, that the soldier would interpret that gesture in that way. So none of the players, none of the actors in this scheme actually craft or actually lay out this plan, but that it just comes into being. So there is a sort of determinism present in Baudrillard in this way, where you can't necessarily escape from your destiny, and how, any sort of belief that you have command over it, like the soldier does in this situation, is just another trompe-l'oeil, right? You are simply just being thrown back into the game. You can never escape that sort of destiny that wrests you away from your own command of yourself, of your being, and then puts you into the realm of the unknown, right? The realm of signification that doesn't necessarily have any clear connection to truth, but can nevertheless elicit very real effects. So it's on that note that I'll end here about midway through Seduction, and I'll have to continue this in the next one, which will probably only be in a few weeks. I'm going away for a while, but I hope that was interesting and helpful. Really, Baudrillard's words are infectious, and they generate more questions than answers, which is part of his thesis here. Is answers scare Baudrillard in a way. Like, answers are inevitably fascist. What do you want? All that he wants to do, to put it as simply as I can, is try to make things less clear. He wants things to correspond to enigmatic principles that can't be mapped or quantified in any sort of recognizable way, which is really, that's what I love about him. But at the same time, it makes me furious. But anyways, for those of you that listen this far, thanks a lot, and I'll see you next time.